Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce the Purdue Maddie's Animal Behaviour resident, Dr. Sara Bennett. Sara is a graduate of the Purdue School of Veterinary Medicine from 2006, and she was in private practice in Evansville, Indiana for 3 years. She has now started her residency program in animal behaviour at Purdue, and she's in her 2nd year. She is doing some research for her residency project on temperament tests and is an expert in the area, so we're very pleased to have her speak to us today. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay with that right there? Yes. Yeah? Okay. All right, as Dr. Lister said, my name is Dr. Sara Bennett. I'm the resident in animal behavior funded by Maddie's Fund at Purdue. I'm in the 2nd year of my residency now, and my research project for my residency and graduate degree is based in temperament testing. So what we're going to be talking about today is temperament tests and what we do and what we don't know about them at this current time, and what do we do with the information that we do have. And so we're going to start out with a couple of definitions of temperament tests. What are people calling them? Then we'll talk a little bit about why they're needed in the shelter environment. Then we'll discuss temperament and the definition of temperament and what does it really mean. Then we'll look at what are the things that we're actually testing when we're doing these, and then how do we use the data that we collect from the testing that we're doing. We'll also touch on standardization as well as validity, and then we'll finish up with looking at examples of a couple of different more popular tests that are being used. As well as the next step after temperament testing is using that for matching appropriate pets to owners. So we'll start with definitions. And essentially a temperament test is a form of behavior assessment tool. Definitions that people have come up with can be very simple. So something that tests that are used as an evaluation tool to classify an individual animal, or a tool to help determine a dog's overall temperament and its potential threshold for aggression. Or they can become quite complex, and you look at some of these definitions taken from some research, and that it's actually a test that measures a dog's behavior, then uses that to describe various traits that that dog might have in an attempt to predict the dog's behavior in a different situation later on. Also, you could look at it as a series of different standardized situations where we do certain things, stimuli or testing situations to create a behavior, and then statistically compare that animal, that individual, in a similar situation later on. And therefore, we can use that to classify that individual animal. So why do we need these tests? So they've been used historically for different purposes. We've used these to select dogs for different uses, such as working dogs, service dogs, identifying appropriate breeding animals. We've used it in shelter medicine mainly to prevent adoption of aggressive dogs. As you can imagine, this is a major public safety concern. We're also using them to try to identify at-risk dogs, so those who may have potential behavior issues that will occur in the home other than aggression. And then we can make educated adoption recommendations, so fitting that animal to the appropriate type of home, or setting up rehabilitation if that's an option where you are. They've also even been used as diagnostic tools, so we may be looking for indicators of disease such as cognitive dysfunction, or looking at it as an indicator of welfare. And when we're looking at the tests that are available, they've tried to classify them into 4 different types of tests. And so we have your traditional test batteries, which most of you are going to be most familiar with, where we actually take a pet and expose it to a variety of different specific stimuli that we actually create artificially, and then we record that dog's reactions in that situation. There's also rating an individual dog, and that's where we get information from that individual pet's behavior historically from some type of informant. And that can be anything from the owner, the former owner who's relinquishing the animal, a handler, or even a caretaker of that animal. We also have expert reading of breed prototypes, and essentially this is where we take someone who's considered an expert, and that can be rather subjective. So someone like a veterinarian or a dog trainer or even an AKC show judge, and those people are asked to describe, rank, and or rate different types of breeds as a whole rather than looking at individual animals. And so you can certainly think of some potential subjective issues with that type of classification. And then you have your observational test, which is where you take a dog and expose it to a natural environment where you're not controlling what's happening here and there, and then you record the behavior that you see upon that. And so it's a little harder to control, but this is actually something that's used fairly often when we're looking at service dogs. So what is temperament? We keep talking about temperament testing, but what really is temperament? Is it a behavior? Is it the character of the animal? What is everybody calling temperament? And even what are people calling personality? A lot of researchers are actually using these terms interchangeably, and so you can imagine this makes things oftentimes very confusing and leads to a lot of inconsistency. When Diedrich and Giffroy were doing a review of the studies that were looking at temperament-based traits, they actually found that one researcher in a study had actually used the word temperament to describe an actual temperament trait that they were trying to evaluate. And can you imagine how hard that paper was to read? And so Sheila Segerson took it upon herself to try to define some of these terms so that's a little more clear exactly what people are trying to talk about. And so she started with character, and what she defined it was as the product of the animal's environment and experiences. It's something that the behaviors are the animal's habits of responding to a situation, so what is typically used to do, and that can actually change due to the environment. And it's actually, if you look at how she described it as developed secondary to experiences, you can consider that a learning history. So an animal may have been in the situation before and learned this certain reaction, got a response, and therefore it's more likely to do that again. And then she looked at temperament, and again, this is very similar to how she defined character, is that it's a pet's natural or innate response to an emotion. It's the environment, and it potentially has an emotional component versus learning. It's considered stable over time, so that's very important when you're looking at the definitions. And it's also considered the foundation of what people are calling personality. Also important to note that character may be able to change it or influence it, but it cannot change it. So it's supposed to be something that's with the animal long term. Then you move on to personality, and of course that's a little bit more of an anthropomorphic term that we're applying to our animals. And she's describing it as a combination of both temperament and character put together. It's the animal's overall way of responding to the environment, so it's learning history coupled with its emotional experiences. And it's based on past experience, which makes sense if you're looking at what character is, and it's also its genetic tendencies, so that's certainly something that's going to be fairly stable. And regardless, when they were looking at these papers, regardless of what term the researcher decided to use to describe their traits, some certain things were stable throughout those papers, if you will. Everybody assumed that these traits that they were looking at are going to be present at an early age, they're going to be relatively stable over time, and that they would expect that the same response they pick up at that point in time is going to be the same response that's going to be elicited in a similar situation in the future. And again, these are all assumptions that people are making. They also assumed, along with the previous slide, that these traits that they're looking at are going to be influenced by things like genetics, the prenatal environment, so whether that puppy was next to a male or female littermate in the womb. What was the mother-offspring relationship? Was it a very nurturing mother, or was it an animal that was taken away from a parent or for whatever reason? What were the early experiences during the developmental periods for that puppy or kitten? And then the learning capabilities of this animal. Is this a very smart, trainable animal who is highly motivated to manipulate its environment, or is it one that's less inclined to do so? So now let's look at what are we really testing, since we've already confused everybody with what the definitions are. Most of the recent testing that has been put out there is really looking at shelters, and the primary tool that they're doing is to look at predicting aggression and potential adoption candidates. And as I stated before, that's obviously a major public health concern. They're also starting to screen for specific behavior problems, so things like separation anxiety, food or resource guarding, the types of things that your more adoptable animals may be developing or becoming apparent after adoption. Other things that they're still being used for is looking at animal success as a working dog or a service dog. And so what are we really testing? So in the simplest form, when you break it down to the very basics, a temperament test is testing a behavioral response to a very specific stimulus at that time in that certain environment by that individual dog. So it's a behavior evaluation. It's a snapshot in time of that dog's behavior. And that's something that we know. I mean, that's something that we can prove. The thing that gets things a little muddy, however, is that we're trying to use that known and extrapolate to different situations. So we're trying to correlate that specific response in that situation in that individual animal at that time as a predictor of how that same animal is going to respond in a similar situation at a different time. And therefore, that would theoretically be predicting temperament and or personality, depending on which one you want to call it. And this is something that we look at external validity. So can we take what we know here in our testing population and apply it to the rest of the population out in the real world? And this is something we don't know. We haven't determined that yet, officially at least. So things that we don't know about these tests. We don't know what the effect of stress in the shelter environment has on these displayed behaviors. Cortisol, which is the stress hormone, we know is elevated, at least initially, in dogs going into a shelter environment. Depending on which study you read is how long that stays high, and some pets we've actually found that it continues to increase as their stress level doesn't decrease over time. And so if you look at some people in the area, they would say that the dog should be given a period of adjustment before we testing, so we're not adding that stress into the unknown mix of things that can change our test results. And then you have other people in the field who say, well, yeah, the dogs are stressed, but we're more likely to identify aggression in a stressed dog who's already close to threshold. And so maybe this is when we really need to be testing these dogs so we can weed out the ones who are going to potentially show aggression at home. Other things we don't know, again, we looked at our definitions. What are we really testing? Are we looking at behavior at that snapshot in time? We know we are doing that. But how does that correlate to character, temperament, and or personality? And so going back to the review of all the literature that's been out there, we know that there are some studies who have shown that their behavioral responses, they call them constructs in the research field, they are stable over time. So they'll test these same dogs again later and come up with the same responses on these tests. And so theoretically, you could be measuring temperament because temperament's assumed to be stable over time, right? But there's also questions that can you actually get a valid assessment with that overwhelming and unnatural environment in a shelter? Because we know that obviously is going to change a dog's behavior than what it is in a home environment. And again, if you look at the testing parameters through these different studies, a lot of the dogs that they're using are known owned animals in a stable environment versus those who are in an unfamiliar shelter type environment. And that could potentially change how the dog tests. And so when we're looking at tests, as I said earlier, test battery is going to be the most commonly used format in the shelter world. And when you're setting up the test, there may be two different categories of how they're trying to set them up. They may take a situation or interaction that's going to be commonly done in an average pet home. So maybe hugging a dog or petting it or getting it riled up in play, like that, trying to take a toy away. Or they may even go so far as to try to provoke a pet in a highly challenging or stressful situation. So maybe they're going to have a stranger physically threaten the owner while the dog's on leash next to it. And obviously that's going to be a very provocative situation for a dog. And then there's also some concerns that there are some types of aggression that may not be able to be identified through these test batteries in a shelter situation. So you may look at things like intraspecies aggression, dog-to-dog aggression within a social group. If the dog doesn't have a social group in the shelter, how are you going to pick up whether that's going to be an issue at home? Also with predatory behavior, if you're not exposing the dog to certain stimuli that may evoke that, and we know predatory behavior tends to be stimulated by a hunger response, again, that may be really challenging to set up in a shelter situation. Same type of thing with territorial. If the dog's not been there long enough to set up its kennel or cage area as its territory, we may not pick this up again. And also there have been a few studies that have looked at young puppies, because that would be ideal to be able to test some of these puppies and determine what their temperament is going to be as an adult. And depending on what age group that you're looking at these puppies, they're finding that there's not really a whole lot of good correlation. And again, some of the really recent stuff that's coming out, within the last 6 months or so, they are finding that it may correlate a little more. The older the puppies are, the further away they are from their socialization or developmental stages. But again, there's not enough evidence there to say that, yes, we can test little puppies and determine what type of dog they're going to be. And so, as we said, at this time, we don't know whether these tests are truly predictive or not. What happens if we get false positive results? So dogs are testing, showing aggression with these very challenging testing situations, is that we've got dogs who are getting euthanized for aggression that may never show aggression in the home environment. Or we could potentially be getting false negative results, which is just as bad. We could be putting dogs out on the adoption floor that are a serious public safety risk. So there's certain issues with each side of that. What are we going to do with the data that we are collecting? Because as you all know, there's lots and lots of shelters that are still doing these tests, and I'm certainly not one to say that they're useless at this point. And so the specialist in the area is that using temperament tests, we use them as an ancillary tool or an additive tool to other information that we have available through that pet. So we may use things like owner relinquishment questionnaires, information we've gotten from the person turning the animal in. But again, there's questions about how valid is that information. So Segerson out in California had again looked at questionnaires with relinquishing owners and found that if the owner is told that the information that they're giving about the pet is not going to be public, is not going to be used to make a decision on whether or not the animal is going to be adopted or not, they actually found that owners were identifying owner-directed aggression as well as fear of strangers more likely than those who were not told that information and assumed that it was going to be public information. Same type of thing if you have someone filling out or taking a history verbally in a quiet enclosed area versus when it's in a crowded waiting room with lots of other people who could overhear the information with that. You also have to take into account the staff experiences with the animal, so that animal caretaker or that handler that's working with the animal. This is essentially an informal observational test type, and so we talked about some of those other testing criteria that previously. And they actually found that when they're looking at this data, that this type of information is actually better at predicting the absence of a problem. And so if we have a pet who, say for instance, we're worried about cage aggression or barrier frustration, if the animal's never experienced that or the handler's never experienced it, you say, okay, yeah, it's pretty likely that it may not be a problem at home, versus if they say there is a problem. Now let's look at standardization and reliability. And obviously these are very, very important things when we're looking at any type of testing on a broad spectrum. So standardizing says that essentially the only variable within the testing situation is that the animal is going to be the variable. So everything else in the situation has to stay the same. That means everybody's performing the test the same way, they're grading the test the same way, the test situations are set up the same way, things like that. And then we have to look at reliability. So if we repeat the test, are we going to get the same results? And ideally, when we're doing these, we want to measure the dog's behavioral response, and we want to have an objective description of the behavior versus a subjective interpretation or anthropomorphic determination of what the animal's doing. So maybe we can say, okay, this dog is showing offensively aggressive behavior because its ears are forward, its front teeth are shown, we can't see the sides, its hackle's up, it's leaning forward, and its tail is up, versus saying, oh, that dog's angry. So there's very, very different interpretations in how we grade that. And then we have to look at our scoring systems. Our scoring systems have to correlate with the types of behaviors that we expect to pick up. And so some of the ones that you may see out there are pass-fail. So maybe very yes, no, the dog shows aggression or does not. And they've got it set up on what their definitions of aggression are. They may have a numerical scoring, so they look at the severity or the intensity of the behavior and score it that way. Or they may have a letter scoring. And whichever system that they choose to use, they need to have some type of key that says, okay, a B- is this type of behavior. And then we also have to look at validity, and that's something that we'll touch about in a few moments. And so again, shelter tests are used primarily at this point to look at aggression, to predict it. And some of the different traits that's more commonly looked at with these pets, we're looking at sociability, so how interested in it is the animal with interacting with humans or people. The handleability of the animal, so is it amenable to having its ears touched, its tails touched, petted over its back, toweled off, things like that. How playful is the pet? What's his play style? Is it a chaser or is it a wrestler? And that can be very important in terms of making an appropriate decision for where that pet goes. What's its arousal level? So when it starts to get play rough and tumble, how long does it take the dog to calm down, or is it still really amped up for a long time afterwards? Is there evidence of food or possessive aggression that we're picking up? What about reaction to a stranger and potentially a child? Or reaction to another dog or another species? You know, a lot of these dogs that I'm preaching to the choir here, you know, are going home to situations where they're going to be interacting on a regular basis with other dogs, cats, you know, pocket pets, things like that. So let's look at validity. And this is going to be a little more of a complicated section of this, and this is why we don't know a lot of the information that we'd like to know about these tests. So when we're looking at validity of these tests, we want to know, are we really measuring what we think we're measuring? I mean, that's a really, really important question within these tests, right? And so there's lots of different types of validity as well as reliability, and we'll attempt to go through and make some basic definitions out of those and what we need to do to determine whether or not these tests are going to be useful. We need to look at external or predictive validity, and so does the test an actually measure of the predicted behavior. So if we do this test here, are we able to extrapolate that and predict that the animal is going to behave in a similar situation out in the real world? So if we have two tests that are supposed to pick up fear, are these going to pick up fear in a similar, is this dog going to show fear in a similar situation out in the real world? Then we'll look at internal validity, and so we have content validity where we're looking at the actual test itself and how well do the different variables of that test represent the desired trait to be evaluated. And again, does the scary stimulus that you're presenting the animal with actually create fear in the dog? And then you look at construct validity and what's the extent of the scale that it's going to create fear. So is your stimulus going to create an extreme fear response in every single animal? Or is there going to be a gradient? Some of these animals who are more prone to being fear, they're going to show an extreme fear response, and your more normal animal is going to show a less extreme fear response. And we need to figure that out, because if we have a test that's going to show an extreme fear response in every single pet, none of these pets are going to pass the test, right? And these definitions can, by all means, get much, much more complicated than what I'm trying to present here. So these are just very basic deliveries of these. And then we look at reliability. And we want to look at different forms of reliability. So we want to look at inter-rater reliability. So different people scoring the same test. Are they getting the same results? Is this consistent between observers? And one way that we can set this up and look at that is have different people simultaneously score the same dog in the same testing environment. Or we can have people watch a video clip back of the test and both score it independently and compare their answers. Are they getting the same scores? And we can look at intra-rater reliability as well. So does the same person scoring the same test at different times, do they come up with the same answers when they rescore the test at a different time? And again, this is really important because you have to have consistency within the person that they're seeing the same behaviors over and over again. And again, using video can be very helpful at this point. We'll have the same person score and then watch the video back and score again, say a week or two later or even longer. And then we need to look at retest reliability. And so, again, which ideally the dog is the only variable in the test. So if we put the dog in the exact same situation, again, ideally, the dog is going to score the same. And so far, what we know about the published literature is that no tests that have been evaluated at this point have passed all of these qualifications, which is unfortunate. There's a lot of unpublished data out there about some of the more popular tests that is leaning towards maybe there are some tests that are going to be actually valid, but it's not been published yet. So until it's published, we don't really know whether or not what they're finding in their preliminary data is really valid. So obviously this is a major area for future research, and this is something that we're looking at Purdue. So now let's go into some examples of tests. The things that you guys are going to be more familiar with. And so I'm going to talk about SAFER tests, which is the ASPCA's test that they typically are using that was developed by Dr. Emily Weiss. She's got 7 different subtests within her assessment. They're set up, as the name implies, to be a relatively safe way to perform the test. We start with lower arousal stimuli and then work our way up to more provocative stimuli for the dog. It's actually set up at this point, to be one of the more standardized tests available. She's very particular about how the person who's performing the test body language is, what type of equipment they're using to perform the test, how the room is set up, having a very detailed score sheet that walks you through how to do it. And she's actually set up a situation where people can go through training in these testing protocols and be certified that they're actually performing the test in the manner that she had designed it. So at this point, this is the type of thing that we need to see to be on the right track for that standardization. One of the tests, it starts out with the look test, and so essentially you're taking the dog's head in your hands and you're looking into their eyes using a soft eye contact, trying to determine how comfortable they are with eye contact, whether or not they're threatened by this or if they may potentially show aggression. Then they move on to the sensitivity test, which is essentially looking at physical sensitivity, where the dog is in front of you and you'll take a firm kneading motion of the skin down the body and then down the leg and then back up again and do that 3 times. Again, looking at the reaction of the dog. Is it turning around and whirling and growling at you, or is it pulling away because it's afraid of the stimulus, or is it enjoying the physical contact? Then we go into the tag test. This is looking at play and arousal level, and so we actually try to engage the dog in play. And she's very particular about the excited voice and the play movement, and then you touch the dog with your finger and go pow, and try to get the dog to interact with you as you're running away. And again, leash contact and how loose and tight your leash are and things like that are very specific in the protocol for this. The squeeze test, this is where we're looking at anticipation of a potentially undesirable physical contact. So the assessor says squeeze, runs her hand down the leg of the dog, and then squeezes in between the toes. So we're setting the dog up that squeeze equals this is what's going to happen. Then they repeat that and see how the dog responds, anticipating that that same physical contact is going to happen again. Then we look at food behavior, and we give the dog a really great mix of canned and dry food. We allow it to start eating. Dog's obviously on leash. And then they take a assessa hand, which is essentially a plastic hand on a stick, so it gives you a little extra reach so you're not sticking your own hand in the food bowl there. And say, I'm going to take it away, and you pull the food away and you see what the response is. And you may pet over the back or push its head out. And again, she's got it very clearly specified in the protocol on which you do first. Do you talk to the dog? Do you pull it away? Do you push the head to the right, to the left, stroke the dog down the back? And in what order you do that. Then you look at toy behavior. So you give the dog a variety of toys, try to initiate it in play, and then again, try to take that toy away. A similar situation that an owner would do. You say, give me that. Use the hand and pull it away. She also specifies in there you can use a rawhide to do the same type of thing. But again, she's very specific on exactly what type of rawhide material is going to be used for the test. And then at that point, we look at dog-to-dog behavior. And so we try to evaluate how that dog is going to respond to an unfamiliar, stable dog or non-reactive dog. And she actually grades the first 10 seconds of visual contact between the two dogs. So as soon as the dog sees the other dog as it's walking into a room, that's what the dog is graded on. Dogs physically have contact with each other, obviously that's a safety issue. And so we're going to look at a quick video clip of a couple pieces of the SAFER test, and we'll go through one more commonly used test situation. So we're going to look at the squeeze test, and that's the one where the person was running their hand down the dog's foot.
Squeeze. No response. Squeeze.
And obviously that dog didn't care too much about having his foot handled. And then we'll look at how they set up the food behavior test.
Give me that. Get out of there.
If you notice in that video, the dog's leash was loose at all times. There was never any tension on the leash. And she was very specific about what she said and which way she pushed the dog's head and how much time she gave the dog to begin eating again before trying to take it away. So now let's look at the other very commonly used test that's being used in shelters across the nation right now. And it's actually, there's lots of different permutations of this test floating around because the initial one is rather long and rather complicated, and it's not exactly user-friendly for most shelter situations because I think it takes like an hour and a half to perform the entire test, and of course time and money isn't of an essence in the shelter situation. And so the Assess-A-Pet, Sue Sternberg's Assess-A-Pet is the other big model for a lot of shelter assessment tests. And so Kelly Boland out at Cornell kind of modified this down to the more important parts that she found that tended to be more valid, and looked at population of shelter dogs with these. And this is her test that she's come up with. So there's 9 different subtests, and a lot of it's going to be similar to what you saw with the SAFER. There's going to be some other things that are importantly different between the 2 tests. So the first thing is cage presentation. We didn't have cage presentation with the SAFER test. And so this gives us an opportunity to look at barrier frustration, potential territorial aggression, things like that. And so the evaluator will go up to the dog in the kennel, walk up to it, look at it for 5 seconds, and then turn down to a less threatening body posture, ignore it, and then begin to talk to the dog. And again, spelled out very clearly, how many seconds are we looking at the dog, how many seconds are we turned to the side, when do we start talking to the dog. And I'll show you a couple video clips of different responses you may see with this test itself. And then she moves on to sociability. The sociability for this one's a little different than what we saw with the SAFER. And so this one, the dog's actually taken out of the kennel into the evaluation room on leash, and the evaluator just stands there and holds on to the leash for 30 seconds. And we see whether the dog goes out of its way to initiate contact with the handler. And then the person will start to speak and touch the dog and stroke it down the back to see how it responds. Then they'll do the teeth examination. So this is kind of correlating with the sensitivity test where they were handling the dog down the side. And so they'll actually take the dog's lips and lift it up to show the teeth and do this 5 times in a row, holding, to see how much struggle there is, whether the dog's amenable to it, or if it pulls its head away, or if it growls, things like that. And then they'll look at handling. They go a little more in depth with handling than the SAFER does. So they'll stroke the dog down the back. They'll pick up a back leg. They'll touch the tail, maybe even get a gentle tug. They'll handle both ears, look inside them, wipe the body down with a towel. So oftentimes, as I've learned being in the behavior clinic, this can be a real trigger for a lot of animals. They're fine with a bath, but then you try to dry them off, and they start to show aggression. They may apply pressure to the shoulders, so push down on the dog, and then give the dog a hug. And again, safety is an issue here, so if we're evaluating potentially aggressive dogs, we have to have a safe way to try to hug a dog. And so again, she's very specific on how you go about putting this dog into a gentle restraining hug, and then how to get away from the animal in a safe manner. Then they do look at arousal level. So again, they engage the dog in play. It's a little less specified than the tag test with SAFER. And then we try to determine the play style, the arousal level, and how long it takes the dog to calm down afterwards. They also look at food bowl, very similar setup. I think the SAFER assessment for the food bowl was actually taken from Sue Sternberg's Assess-A-Pet, so exactly the same type of protocol. She does look at possessions as well, so we look at a variety of different toys, try to find something the dog's interested in. And then she'll also add in a rawhide, but rather than having a standardized piece of unbasted, knotted rawhide, which is what the SAFER test calls for, they'll actually talk about the best piece of rawhide you could possibly find, so the bacon basted pig ear or something like that. Then they'll look at strangers, and again, a major portion that was not present in the SAFER test. They'll have a person dressed in a coat and a hat, knock on a door, and then the handler who's sitting in a chair says, "Who's there? Come in." And the person walks in very briskly, stands there and stares at the dog, and then reaches out and takes 2 more steps towards the dog. And that's obviously a very threatening behavior to a dog. See how the dog responds, and then they turn down and greet the dog in a friendly manner. And then again, the dog introduction. She will actually score a little longer than the SAFER does, and sometimes the dogs may be able to actually contact each other. But again, major safety issues included with that. And we'll finish up here with a couple of video clips of the different portions of the Assess-A-Pet. So we'll start with the cage presentation. I'm going to show you 2 different responses to the same cage presentation. These are actually courtesy of Dr. Brian DeGangi in University of Florida. He actually worked with Kelly Boland with her research. So you can see this dog is obviously very motivated to interact with him, showing lots of friendly, lots of appeasement behavior, licking, jumping, wagging the tail, things like that. And it actually gets a little frustrated because she's got that barrier in between her and him, and she's actually starting to bite at the chain link of the kennel. And then we'll look at this dog here, who's going to show you a very different response to the same test. And watch as he leaves. See the dog freeze, the hard stare? And he charges him as he starts to turn his back. I mean, that's a very, very different response than what we got the first time. And then we're going to look at handling. And again, same type of thing. He's going to be using the towel and pushing down on the shoulders. Obviously, this dog's not too concerned.
Tug slightly on the collar.
So that dog was actually pretty motivated to go in the direction he was tugging, so he actually drugged the handler after he started in a direction. Okay. And so those are two very commonly used test examples that people are either using that in and of itself or they're making their own versions of this. Obviously, if we're making our own versions of this, that decreases our standardization and potential for valid testing. And so let's look at the next step after our temperament test, our behavior evaluations, and what can we do following that. And that'll go into pre-adoption screening and matching programs. The ASPCA has also made, in addition to the safer behavior assessment, the Meet Your Match program, and this is where they are trying to match individual dogs with potential adopters' lifestyles and expectations. And so this is, in essence, supposed to help maintain the animal in the new home and prevent relinquishment later on. And so essentially what they've done is they've come up with another assessment where they're calling it their canine-ality personality profile. And again, anthropomorphic but cute term that's going to appeal to the public. And based on this behavior assessment tool, this dog is placed into a color group with a corresponding description. There may be different variables within that group. And then the potential owners who come in who are interested in adopting fill out a self-survey. They are then placed into a color group as well, and they're encouraged to go through the shelter and look for the dogs that match the same color, and that's supposed to be their ideal matching area. They also have one for cats. It's called the feline-ality. Same type of program. The cats are assessed, put in a different area or a different category, and then owners or potential owners are encouraged to match within that. And again, no data of this success of this program has been published yet. There's a lot of anecdotal information out there that's showing that their re-relinquishment rates have decreased once implementing these programs, but again, nothing's been published yet. And again, this is another area of research that's going to be going on at Purdue to try to get some of this data published.